Welcome to this live webinar brought to you by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the chair of Israel Studies at UCLA, and it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers in this webinar. First, we'll hear a presentation by Professor Ben-Porat, who is the co-author with Fanny Yuval of the book being discussed, Policing Citizens, Minority Policy in Israel, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press. Professor Ben-Porat is the chair of the Politics and Government Department at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel, where he's joining us today. He's also the author of Global Liberalism, Local Populism, Peace and Conflict in Israel, Palestine and Northern Ireland, which was published by Syracuse University Press in 2006, and Between State and Synagogue, The Secularization of Modern Israel, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2013. He is also the editor or co-editor of numerous collected volumes and articles dealing with religion and state, secularization, multiculturalism and public policy, and conflict resolution. After Professor Ben-Porat's presentation, we will hear from our discussant today, Stephen Popper, who is a senior economist at RAND and a professor of science and technology policy at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. In 2008, he was appointed the founding director of the RAND Israel Initiative, and he's led a series of projects for RAND, for Israel's government, dealing with domestic policing, strategy for the use of natural gas and future energy planning, and assisting the government of Israel to develop systems for engaging in long-term socio-economic strategic planning. Since 2010, he's also been a senior fellow of the Jewish People Policy Planning Institute, and he sat on the International Advisory Board of the Israel Innovation Institute and on the Academic Advisory Board of the Shoresh Institute for Socio-Economic Research in the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University. I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers today and thank them for joining us. Before I turn over to Professor Ben-Porat, I'd just like to remind you all to send us your questions. This is a live webinar. You do have a chance to ask questions, so please feel free to send the questions using the Q&A function. And after we've heard from Professor Ben-Porat and Professor Popper, I will read your questions to both speakers and we'll have plenty of time to answer your questions. So without further ado, let me thank you again for joining us today and turn over to Professor Ben-Porat.
Thank you, Dov, for the introduction, for the invitation. It's great to be with you from far away, but yet we're able to do this. Let me open my screen here so I can start talking about the book. So when we began to write this book, after we collected the material, it came to my mind that we are talking about something which is not just policing. It's about citizenship. So when we discuss policing, we are talking about wider issues. We're talking about questions of statehood, of citizenship, and of inequalities and hierarchies within that citizenship. So through the lens of policing, we look at Israel, but we also have a wider perspective on questions compared elsewhere. I will try in this presentation to talk a bit about the idea behind the book, about some of the findings, and hopefully relating it to developments happening elsewhere. I'm a political scientist. I've been in this field for more than 20 years. When I began to research policing, what struck me was that political scientists gave little attention to policing, which was surprising considering how important it is in everyday life. So for a political scientist, to look at questions of policing, the way I see it, is a way to look at politics from a very interesting angle. Now, when we do discuss policing, it's often through those shocking incidents of police violence, recorded violence, of counter-violence, but everyday life events, these banal happenings in which officers arrest people or stop them on the street might be no less significant than those shocking incidents. So if we go back to sociology and to Weber, and we think of the definition of the state, of legitimate violence, of legitimate monopoly over state violence, then policing is the arm of the state that enforces this violence. By making sense of violence, we can make sense of citizenship. So police violence, or order, if you will, is something that is deeply political, that resonates with many other questions that we raise in this book. So one question that is often asked is, what does police do? I mean, what is the purpose of policing? And one can say policing is about production or reproduction of order. So when police stops people, arrests people, or orders people what to do, it is about a wider sense of right and wrong and order. But when you think politically, it's a very specific order that police often produces or reproduces. It's about often domination, about interests. And those interests often conflict or come at the expense one of the other. So policing, behind the simple notion of order, is also a very political act. And when you think of citizenship as one of the most important foundations for the modern state, it's about status. It's about equality for all individuals within a territory. But citizenship is also about differentiation or discrimination. So when you think of citizenship as something which is universal or total, there are other aspects within it which are hierarchical, which have an impact on specific groups and peoples. We can also think of it as a right of movement. So being a citizen is also about the right to move around freely. And policing has a major effect on our ability to move and to feel free. And in certain circumstances, we can see what we call securitization, that states in certain times can flex their muscles, can constrict citizenship using all kinds of justification. And these constrictions, again, are unequally distributed. So citizenship is about equality in principle, but in practice, it's often also about hierarchies and differentiation. So when you think about what does it mean, policing, for citizens, this might be an everyday test of their citizenship. So when a person encounters bureaucrats of all kinds, but police officers especially, he learns about his or her power and status. The way he can move around, be protected, or be neglected is a clear sign about his worth as a citizen. So interaction with police officers is about a way to evaluate your citizenship, a way to think about how you are treated compared to others, how people like you are respected or not compared to other people. So stigma or respect receive a meaning in those seemingly banal encounters between officers and citizens. So it's beyond simple or not simple events of violence. It's about symbolic. It's about the way that citizens are perceived as equal citizens, but it's also about comparison to others. So fair treatment signals to us that we and the police are on the same side. Police protects us because we are worthy of protection. But if we are not protected or targeted by police, then we are signaled that we are marginalized, that we are stigmatized, that we are unequal. So these everyday encounters which could seem banal to the outsider, can have a major significance to certain people. So we can talk about citizenship as segmented, as marked by racial, class divisions, and where order and rule of law are contested. It's about legitimacy. So for some people of some groups, for some reason, what police do does not seem legitimate or representing a moral order. It can be perceived as unfair and discriminating. So the ability to move around freely is actually a concrete issue for people. Some citizens can feel they are protected because they are worthy and deserve it. Others can feel neglected, that they do not deserve protection. And others can feel they are depicted as security threats. So we can think of three types of movements. Those who can move freely and be protected, those who feel unprotected and therefore restrict their movements, and those who are perceived by the police and the state as a threat, and their movements will be restricted. And when we look at different countries, and here's the comparative angle, we can see from data that some minorities trust police less than majorities. Now, this can be about different reasons. It could be about more overarching questions of legitimacy. So if this minority feels alienated, not part of society, then police for him is just another example of his lower status. So if that's the case, then what police will do or will not do might not really matter. If from the get-go, I can't identify with the state and the police is representative of the state, then whether police will be more or less positive towards me will make little difference. But we can think also of more particular issues which could be pertinent. One is what we call over-policing. So some citizens might believe, often for good reasons, that police is targeting them. They are being racially profiled. Force is used against them excessively more than against other groups. That's one issue, over-policing. The other is under-policing. Some groups might feel they are neglected, that police does not provide them with services, does not protect them, and they often do this in comparison to others. So the fact that my neighborhood is unsafe and I can't walk freely in my neighborhood is because police does not care enough to make it safe. So with these concepts, we come to study Israel. And I have here kind of three representative pictures. On the right-hand side, you have a picture of young Ethiopians that protest police violence. On the left-hand side, Arab citizens protesting police violence, but also police neglect. In the middle, you have an American picture. And I bring this into the story because we can find parallels between things happening here, there, and in many other places. So while we use Israel as our case study, the issues we discuss here, we think, are much more generic and comparable. So what we try to do in this study is to study police and policing from the perceptions of citizens. So we're trying to look at how citizens perceive police. Legitimacy, trust, need, expectations, all these are questions we raise. And we compare four different groups, which again are to some extent are generic. We have Arab citizens, a national minority. We have Jews of Ethiopian descent, who are a racialized minority. We have Jews of former Soviet Union, who are immigration, relatively strong and well integrated. And ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are a religious minority, that has a very complex relation with the state. We compare these four groups to another group of citizens who are, we call the comparative group, who are not part of all the other groups. We use two methods. We have a survey we have conducted with these five groups, and focus groups before the survey to try and tease out the questions or the issues that these groups think when police is on the table. So I'll talk about only two groups today because of the shortage of time, but these are the two most interesting groups. Let me begin with kind of a general talk about Israel and its police force. So when you think about Israeli police in comparison to the American police, it's a centralized police force. So if you think of the LAPD or the NYPD as kind of independent institutions, it's one police in Israel with one command. The police has a very strong relation to the military. Officers come from the military, so military is part of their mode of thinking, and the shift between those two institutions is very significant. Israeli police, compared to American police, does not use much firearms. The numbers of citizens being shot to death by police is relatively small, but they come from particular groups. And police, last case, has a problematic public image. So when surveys come about, talking about the image of police compared to the army or other institutions, police ranks quite low. Citizenship in Israel is also very segmented compared to the US. It's hierarchical. It has deep schisms, Arabs and Jews, secular religious, etc. It's very securitized with an ongoing conflict. And there are many questions about the state, its Jewish and democratic character that overshadow all these schisms and make them all the more problematic. Let me go straight into our two case studies. So let's begin with the Arab citizens, who are a national minority. Now, if we describe in general terms, describe them, they have a complex relation to the state institutions. It's a very contested citizenship. Being a Jewish state, Arab citizens, by definition, are on the margins or the outside. So they have a lack of moral alignment. It's a Jewish state. It's very hard to align with it. Trust and legitimacy are limited. But on the other hand, research shows that we do have some evidence of what we call pragmatic integration. So while the state is hard to identify with, everyday life has also its so-called positive impact. Police and Arab citizens have a very troubled relation due to its representation of a coercive state and the fact that Arabs are often securitized. They're perceived as a security threat. It's a large minority, about 20% of the population, and its integration and exclusion are contradictory. Both happens simultaneously. Now, overshadowing all these relations is the so-called 2000 events. In those events, demonstration by Arab citizens in the First Intifada resulted with the shooting to death of 13 Arab citizens by the police. There was an investigation committee after the events who criticized both police and the state, but no officers were charged with misconduct. So this is an opening wound still having an effect on the relations with the police. Since 2000, the police has made various attempts to change relations with Arab citizens. Many initiatives took place with overall limited success. In those 15 or 20 years, about 50-something more citizens were killed by the police. This is a total sum number, including those involved in alleged terrorism. But if you want to compare it, only 3 non-Arab citizens were killed by the police. So 51 does not sound like a big number. It's very large comparatively. However, when we began to do this research, what struck us was that major concern among Arab citizens was not under, but over policing. The major complaint they had over police was about neglect. Now, after we received the data, it made sense, because since 2000, 50 citizens were shot to death by police, but 1,200 were killed in internal criminal violence. The number of Arab citizens who were murdered in crime events is more than twice compared to the relative size of Israeli society. So Arab citizens, their major concern is security of walking the streets safely, facing crime, facing illegal weapons, facing gang warfare. Also, many Arabs do not have that much contact with police. So being stopped while driving or harassed happens, but is not a major event. So under policing is for Arab citizens a major issue. It's about neglect. It's perceived by them as what we call relative deprivation. This neglect is intentional, it's not incidental. It demonstrates their value as citizens. So what they describe to us and elsewhere is a feeling of living every day with violence, being afraid to walk the streets at night, being afraid for their children, being afraid for their students, a feeling of suffocation caused by the ever-growing situation of violence, which has not been resolved to date. I mentioned the term relative deprivation. So when we ask Arab citizens, how do you perceive policing in compared to others? So they are certain that in Jewish towns, in Jewish neighborhoods, policing is much better. Now this is important because while many citizens of all types will rank police low in terms of service, for Arab citizens, it's also about relative deprivation. So we sincerely believe that had we been Jewish, this would not have happened. Police would have been here much sooner. So in the focus groups, this feeling was very strong, and as things continue, it's still a major issue, the issue of police neglect. Now to the Ethiopian immigrants. This is a different story of a smaller sized group whose main concern is police violence and police profile. When we began this research, things were a bit in the shadows. The issue of police violence was known, did not receive much attention in the press, and even Ethiopians have tended to deny that. So when they were trying to tell them, well, is this like what happens in Baltimore? It was like, yes and no. We are aware of racism and skin color, of us being visible minorities, but we are also adamant that we are Israeli citizens. We are part of the Jewish state. We belong here, and we want to be part of this state. So being in a lower socioeconomic status, suffering from racism, is perceived as temporal, or was perceived as temporal, as incidental, and something that might go away soon. When we saw them at demonstrations, when they were interviewed, those young people often made it clear that they are valuable citizens. They came with Israeli flags. They talked about their military service, about their sacrifice, and the unfairness of the way the state treats them. So often they try to downplay racism, often trying to talk about, well, this will go away sometime. But in 2016, something happened. A young Ethiopian soldier was stopped and beaten by the police. This was aired and televised. It became viral. And this brought a whole new discourse among young Ethiopians about police brutality and police racism. Unlike the elders, these guys were less willing to compromise. For them, this had to be stopped now, immediately. And when police and others talked about cultural accommodation, their response is, we're Israelis. We were born and raised here. It's about racism, not cultural accommodation. And in recent interviews, the comparison with what happened in America was more out there in the open. Profiling, stigmas, being black, like in American movies. So this came in many of the focus groups and the interviews. What also came about is the perception of vulnerability. That the fact that we are being stopped, profiled, abused, subjected to violence, it's because we are vulnerable, because no one will speak for us. There's a sentence that came in several focus groups where people said, if I was a white kid and police would stop me or arrest me, my mother would come down to the station and give them hell. Nobody will speak for us. So there's a very strong perception of vulnerability and a demand that all this would stop. So we have here two groups that is, one of them is a national minority whose integration is problematic, but with pragmatic desires. And its main issue is under-policing neglect. And we have another minority who really wants to integrate. And when we did the first survey, Ethiopian immigrants were the group that had the highest trust in police. And we kept saying, why? How can that happen? I mean, what can explain the fact that people that acknowledge racism, acknowledge unfairness, still have trust in police? Our answer was, it's a way to counter the stigma, to say I do belong here, to say that racism is not an issue, it's temporal, anecdotal. But after the 2016 events, things have changed. Now it was about, well, there is racism here. I am Israeli. I'm not denying racism, I'm fighting it. So what we're seeing, and since this book was written, was a more adamant and confident young Ethiopian cadre who is fighting against racism. So in conclusion, I'll say that policing in Israel and elsewhere is a very interesting and good way, I would say, to evaluate citizens, belonging, identities. When we talk about minorities in the plural, we often forget that minorities differ. So minorities might all distrust police, but for different reasons. And this differentiation is important because causes are also about reforms. We want to understand why a certain minority distrusts police, or why police is legitimate for it. We need to think of its history, its current structure in which it lives its life, and those trajectories, which might differ. And the two words which resonate is visibility and vulnerability. So minorities who are visible and vulnerable are the ones more likely to be targeted. If you're visible and securitized, you will be stopped by police officers. If you're vulnerable, this talk might have more severe consequences. So with those conclusions, I'll leave it to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. Your book really presents us with a fascinating triad between concepts of citizenship, policing, and the nature of minority and minority relations in Israel. It occurred to me as you were speaking that it might be useful to actually discuss a little bit more, especially for an American audience, what the differences are between the police in Israel and the police forces as we know them. My knowledge of this comes from having done a project with the police. As Dov mentioned, this was a project funded half by the government of Israel, half by private foundation donorship to RAND, including the Nazarian Family Foundation. And just running through these, I think, begins to give a little bit of insight into exactly what the nature of policing in Israel might be like. As you mentioned, it is nationally organized, not locally organized, as in the United States. In the United States, there are literally thousands, of police and sheriff departments, if not tens of thousands. The Israel police also are responsible for domestic policing and crime prevention. But in addition to that, they're the border patrol, they are the highway patrol, they are drug, alcohol, and firearms enforcement. They are the equivalent of the FBI, so the Agency for Criminal Investigations. They, as we know from the newspapers, conduct anti-corruption investigations. They operate the National Emergency Call Center. They are the organization for domestic counter-terror operations. They maintain the National Emergency Crisis Center. They administer and they manage the Civil Guard volunteers. And in marked contrast to the United States, the police prosecute. They're the prosecuting agency of over 80% of all cases in the criminal court system. Now, this is all with a force of about 30,000 sworn officers. So I think about the same amount or a little bit lower than the number of sworn officers in New York City, in a country of 9 million people. And they have almost no civilian employees. So the people who are the clerks and so on are also sworn police officers. You spoke about the sort of quasi-military, the relation with the military. I mean, there is no formal relationship with the military. The police are operated out of a different ministry than the Ministry of Defense. But the people, the police in Israel, were astounded to hear that, the vast majority, well over 90% of police chiefs in the United States began as simple patrolmen. Whereas in the Israel police, if you were an officer in the IDF, you come over and have a similar rank in the police. You don't start as a simple policeman. 80% of the population of Israel is either Jewish or affiliated with a Jewish household. There are about 400,000 people in that category. The police are overwhelmingly Jewish, well over 90%. 90, I don't know what the current number is. And then the rest are principally Druze and Bedouin with some Christian Arabs. And the problem, as you allude to in your book, is that there is this whole question about representation. The doors are open, but the extent to which people from either the Arab Palestinian community who are citizens of Israel or the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, which wish to be represented in the police force is a different matter. I think the final thing to point out is that certainly compared to the United States, police in Israel are relatively poorly paid. for level of experience and education, and they don't earn overtime. They just continue to work. So this really leads me to the first question I want to pose to you, and that is the police as an organization. I mean, in Israel, police bashing is something of a national pastime. The society sometimes, to me, resembles a dysfunctional family in which there are two brothers, and as far as the parents are concerned, the older brother, in this case the IDF, can do no wrong. No matter what happens, the older brother is not to blame. Whereas the younger brother is constantly being heckled and pointed at and criticized. Why can't you be more like your older brother? So it's an organization with internal contradictions. And in your book, you, I think quite rightly, describe the police as kind of a mirror and transmission belt of society's concept of citizenship and participation. And on the other, it is the principal interface between the population at large and certainly minority populations with the government. So the question that I have is, should the police be perceived as kind of this black box in between the two layers? Or do we need to delve into the nature of the police themselves in Israel, the particularities? Where does professionalism of the police enter in? Are there causal explanations beyond these two relationships for why things may be, as you, I think, quite accurately portray in your book? So to what extent does what goes on within the organization itself also either amplify or transform messages sent and messages received by not only minorities populations in Israel, but by the citizenry at large?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a good question. Let me start by saying that we have not researched police itself. So our research is about how citizens perceive police. Having said that, you're onto something which I agree. Police is, to some extent, not so much a black box, but something that everything is thrown at the police. So when you talk about racism, discrimination, and tense relationship, it's not just about the police, it's about the state and its citizens. Ethiopian citizens and Arab citizens will be discriminated elsewhere as well. But policing is just so in your face. It is so obvious. It has such a clear message that it might raise stronger tones against it. So in that sense, police is reflective of larger things in society. And that's why we talk about citizenship here, not just about police. It's a platform to discuss how Israel's different groups interact and how the hierarchies between them come about. So yes, I agree to all your comments on police. You could fairly say that it has a very large burden on its shoulders and limited resources to deal with all these issues. That's all fair and true. Yet those weaknesses and those problems will have a more negative impact on particular groups. So even those limited resources will be divided unequally, and again, reaffirm or recreate those tensions and hierarchies.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the different communities that that you do discuss in the book. The Arab Palestinian community within Israel, the citizens of Israel, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox community, the Ethiopian immigrant community, and the Russian immigrant community. And I found the treatment in in your book. Absolutely fascinating. As a matter of fact, based on that, being an analyst, I kind of put together a table and a spreadsheet of various factors, the extent to which each community seeks admission and acceptance into the larger society, the extent to which it's securitized, the extent to which it is to some extent represented in the police force. And then one that I don't think appeared in the book, which I added, which is to what extent does that community have what you might call a cultural predisposition towards relations with secular authority that is somewhat problematic. And what I found was that, in different combinations of each of these, there would be two of these groups that would, sort of light up as this being a problematic area, and then another two where it was less of a concern. And a couple of interesting things. One is that the only of these categories where I found that all four groups sort of lit up was, what I call the cultural disposition to secular authority. Arab Palestinians trying to figure out how to be something unique, an Arab minority within the Middle East. The Haredim, whose society is very much, based upon, rejecting either the secular or larger, religious community around them. The Ethiopians, who of course were a minority within their own country, their country of origin, before coming to Israel to find themselves a different sort of minority. And Russian immigrants, because of the sort of near sociopathic relationship between the governed and the governed that existed in the former Soviet Union. So I guess this really kind of raises two questions in my mind, and I'll put them both to you at the same time. One is, did you find yourself surprised, or would you agree that the two groups that seem to be the most problematic are also the ones that are largest in size, namely the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel on the one hand and the Haredim on the other? And then the second question, really, I'm just fascinated looking at your survey result. And I wonder how much the larger Israeli culture enters in. One of the last things one wants to feel that one is in Israeli society is a friar, sort of a sap, somebody who's taken advantage of. Everybody's in on the game except for you, and they're kind of all against you. So the data you present seem to show that even in the control group, while there are measurable differences with the results from respondents from the minority groups, the contrast is not particularly stark. So how do you police in a society in which everyone, with considerable exaggeration, to some extent feels, or at least responds, like a poorly policed minority?
Thanks. I think in both questions, there's a power issue looming behind them. In the case of Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, there's a major difference that ultra-Orthodox have the power to make a choice. So for them, a decision to enter or exit society is more of a free choice. And for many years, this society has chosen exclusion.
Yes.
We do not need police. We can police ourselves. When police do come in, it's often against their will. Why are you here? We can deal with ourselves. Now, in recent years, there are major changes in society, more interaction, of more, I would say, openness to certain issues. So the attitude towards police is reluctant. We don't fully trust them, not sure we need them, but we are becoming more Israeli citizens, hence maybe we do need to better relation with them. And maybe there are issues that we do need them. For example, in domestic abuse, which became an issue in several cases. And there's a big split within that group. For Arab citizens, I think police neglect for many years was a two-sided relationship. So 30 years ago, if Arab society was more traditional and could rule itself through its own institutions, these are falling apart now. So Arab society is kind of a void. The police was not there. Things have happened. Police has to come in and help us resolve those issues, but we don't trust them, or we're not sure they really want to come in. So it's kind of a feeling of neglect. Again, in some of the discussions, we were very clear. We think police are actually happy with us killing each other. Now, this is their perception. It might be wrong, but yet that's the way they interact with police. So both groups distrust police. However, one of them is more in comfort in its own position, the Haredim. They can make their own choices of how to interact. And even though they suffer from violence, or police violence, it's mostly in demonstrations. So a Haredi man walking down the street will not be profiled. In a demonstration, police might use excessive force. And it's an important difference, because many of them would say, those demonstrators, we're not with them. They're extremists. So that's the first question. What is really culture? I think it relates to what you said in the beginning. Police is rated very low among all Israelis. So when you do the comparisons, that there's no big differences. But when you ask why you distrust, that's where I think you do see a difference. So an Israeli, Jewish, let's say white citizen would distrust police for being ineffective, but not against him, just in general. And Arab citizens will say, no, it's not that they're ineffective. It's discrimination. Had I been Jewish, things would have been different. So I think even with this data, which does not show differences on some levels, there are differences which I think are telling the story here of citizenship.
Let me ask Dov, do I have time for another question, or do you want to?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in, but we can go over the hour slightly. So if you have a final question for Guy, go ahead.
Well, in the long tradition of final questions, I'll make it a two-parter. And thank you, Guy, very much. And let me apologize in advance. You and I come from the social sciences, but you spend your time as a researcher. I spend my time as a policy analyst. So these questions may be a little bit unfair. But let me go ahead. So what do the popular perceptions of the Israel police and the actual nature of the organization say about the state of Israel? More particularly, does the situation of policing and minorities in Israel reflect the all too common instance of a society failing to fully live up to its ideals? Or is it an accurate reflection of the de facto ideals present in contemporary Israel? And I realize that's a somewhat difficult question to answer, so I will ask an even more difficult question. So many of the institutions of the State of Israel were put together on an emergency basis with the idea that they would be reviewed at some later time when the nation was not under the threat of an annihilation that it perceived itself to be for so many decades. And the founding fathers of Israel also had a view of a centralized government. They came from a socialist background, and that was their conception. That Israel has changed something on the margins and the nature of its governance, but it's still kind of largely, there are centripetal forces that seem to bring everything back to the national center. So is this yet another area where, the original centralized concept for the state needs to be rethought? in light of the state's and the society's evolution? That is to say, does the model of national policing need to be reviewed with perhaps moving more towards local control in order to deal with some of the issues that your work so admirably demonstrates are present?
Yes, difficult questions. I'll try and answer the best I can. So what we can learn in Israel from the attitudes towards the police, as you alluded, it's about governability. I think Israel is in a governability crisis, distrust of institutions, and police is just one of them, but maybe more severe than others. Having said that, and looking at data from elsewhere, I think these crises can be found elsewhere. So those issues of distrust of institutions is not unique to Israel. And I must say that, being in the US for several years in several instances, I think Americans, or I would say it differently, I think Israelis can relate to their police as less intimidating, as less a threat, for the good and for the bad. And I think maybe you've seen that when you were in Israel, when a police officer would stop you on the road and pull you over, you would walk over to him and lean on his car and talk to him. I don't think you would do that in a highway west. That would not be a very good move to make. So I think there's a cultural issue here which has both positive and negative effects. I also agree with your second question proposal. Israel has made some major changes. I would say that the two largest ones are neoliberalism, with privatization and a growing gap of inequality between people that has impact on crime and other issues, and becoming a de facto multicultural state. We have different groups of different religions and cultures, and to train police to such complexity requires resources which, as you hinted, are not there yet. So there is, from my perspective, my conclusion of this book, what Israeli police needs mostly is civilian control, is being demilitarized and changing its mode of operation from semi-military force into a police force. This is a major change, which I don't see happening in the coming years. And if we stick to the old model that you described, which is centralized and militarized, this might fall short of what is actually needed.
Yeah. And if I could just follow up on that just very, very briefly. If again, think of it, almost overwhelmingly, the police force in Israel are ex-IDF. And in IDF, you're not stationed, in Okinawa or Korea. You're stationed, right in the country. So you're switching hats. You were IDF, and now you're police in the same place where you previously served your military service. But you're no longer part of a military organization. You're part of a supposedly civilian organization. And this may be a very difficult transition to make, both for individuals and organizational. Thank you very much, Guy, for your answers.
Thank you, Stephen and Guy, for that really fascinating conversation. Our audience has certainly been very engaged. We've received quite a lot of questions. We have about a dozen questions that have come in. So I'm going to just try to get through as many of them as possible. I'll probably just only be able to pose one question from each of the people that have sent in questions. And I'll try and group a few of them together. So we have one question from Mohammed Darwasha, who's asking about the applicability of the Israeli case. Guy, you mentioned at the beginning that, the idea that your book can use Israel as a kind of generic case study and that it is applicable to other democracies around the world, like the United States. And the question that Mohammed Darwasha asks is whether that's indeed the case, whether or whether Israel as an ethnic state, as a Jewish state specifically, therefore has a very different and a very specific kind of relationship with its Arab citizens, rather than so-called kind of non-ethnic liberal democracies that purportedly claim to represent all their citizens. In the case of Israel, it is a state, and even more so since the passage of the nation-state law, that upholds Jewish citizens in many ways above Arab citizens. So does that mean that it's not really applicable, or that difference means that these issues are more specific to Israel than to other democracies?
Yes and no. We compare things that are different, not things that are the same. If it's the same, there's no reason to compare. So holding those differences, we can ask, what is there to compare? So national minorities exist in other countries. Does the fact that Israel is an ethnic state matter? Of course it does, absolutely. But other national minorities could also report similar issues of discrimination of different kinds. Ethiopian citizens talk about skin color, about racialization. That's obviously not just in Israel. Religious minorities. So I agree that Israel is a unique case, but then all cases are unique to some extent. But I think the concepts we use here, over-policing, under-policing, citizenship, etc., I think those concepts do invite a comparative discussion. So I do think that we could talk about the way U.S. police treats people of black skin color to what happens in Israel to Ethiopians and Arabs. So over-policing and police violence, I think, are absolutely comparable.
Thank you. So we have a question from Dr. Patricia Sohn from the University of Florida. And I'll read the question, I'll try and abbreviate it. I think of citizenship as about neither rights nor equality, but as about a political contract between citizens and the state, whereby citizens get some role in their own governance, assert the sovereignty of their government, people, territory, establish laws and guidelines. In exchange, they agree to be ruled by the state. And the state, in turn, agrees to establish authority, protect citizens, etc. So equality, according to this conception of citizenship, isn't necessarily equality, or even rights aren't baked into the concept of citizenship. Rather, citizenship is a kind of political contract. Does thinking of citizenship in this way change how we understand its application in Israel? In other words, not thinking of citizenship as one built upon notions of rights or equality, but rather as one based upon this political or social contract?
It's a good question, which deserves more thought than the answer I'm going to give now. But I think that it's about contracts in the plural, not contract in the singular. So different groups of individuals have different contracts with the state. And I think contract is a metaphor, because we never signed that contract. It's been enforced upon us. So if you're an Ethiopian immigrant to Israel, or a Russian immigrant, or an Arab citizen, it's not you can negotiate what contract you want to sign with the state. It's a given. And in this contract, and we can use different metaphors, it carries different obligations and different rights that no matter how we call them, differentiate between different groups. Hence, I think citizenship can work as a discussion of rights. And I'm intrigued especially by the right of movement, the right to move freely, which distinguishes between people of different classes, ethnicities, racialization, and all these questions, I think, are very pertinent here.
So we have a number of the questions focus on the specific minority groups that you discuss in the group. So I'll try and group a couple of them together. With regards to Arab citizens of Israel, that you mentioned, actually, I think it was Stephen mentioned in his remarks, that the police are overwhelmingly Jewish, or roughly more than 90%, and that there's a much underrepresentation of Arab citizens of Israel in the police force. Would it be possible, what would need to happen for the police to be reorganized to become more representative of the of Israeli citizens, and in particular to increase the representation of Arab citizens of Israel. Are steps being made in that direction? Is that a reform that's being undertaken? Would that make a significant difference in your mind if the Israeli police were to become more representative?
So we deal with this in the book quite extensively. I'd say from the beginning that representation is important, but I would not put everything on it. We know from other countries that minority officers can adopt the perception of the organization and not of their own community. You know this real well from the United States. It might be the same in Israel. So if nothing changes but more Arabs in the police, the impact might be more limited than what we hope for. Now, there were attempts by the police to recruit more Arab officers with some success. Among Arab citizens, despite everything said about the lingering memory of 2000 and before, there was quite a large acceptance of the idea that Arabs would serve in the police. So many citizens said, we are not against it. Now, between saying and doing, there's always a gap, but it's not impossible. So if police would be perceived as more about equality and more about serving, and bear in mind the fact that Arabs are aware of the fact that without police, there is no security. So police is a necessity, then this might open the way for more recruitment and more representation. Police has made some efforts with some success, but the hurdles are quite big, nevertheless.
So a couple of, some of the questions have concerned other kinds of reforms that might be undertaken or that have been undertaken here in the United States. For example, in the United States, they have community policing, the recent adoption of body cameras, as well as anti-bias training. And you mentioned in your presentation the reluctance with regards to cultural training. One of the questions from Dana Ernst asked if you could elaborate on that reluctance, and also if you could mention, are there these other kinds of reforms taking place, like anti-bias training, body cameras, other things to increase the, to change some of these negative perceptions with regards to the police?
So regarding community policing, I think Stephen might be a good source to ask about that in a second. From the perceptions of citizens, and also when we talk to leaders and policymakers, the two, I would say, easiest reforms on the table are recruitment of minorities and cultural training. Now, cultural training is seen a bit with cynicism. So the officers come here, they dine with us, they talk with us, but it doesn't really change anything. So Arabs are a bit reluctant. Ultra-Orthodox are actually more accepting. I mean, we do want the police to know that we are different. We have different culture. They need to respect the way we live. So having them learn about us is not that bad. Ethiopians, that's interesting, are very strongly against it. Because from their perception, cultural training means that they have not integrated. But the problem is with their culture. And what they have clearly been saying for the past 3 or 4 years is that we are totally against it. We're Israelis. We were born here, raised here. We speak Hebrew. The whole cultural issue is just a way to divert from the main question, which is police racism. So from their perception, cultural training is something that should not be on the table for a very simple reason. We are part of society, and that is not the major issue.
Great. So we have a question from Louisa Klepnikova yes.
I think you say something about community policing, because I think that
yeah, sure. Sorry.
quite important than that.
Just very briefly, yes, there is community policing in Israel. There are community officers on the Israel police force. It's not something that has, diffused throughout the entire organization. We attempted to, in our project, we attempted to acquaint the Israel police with a number of things. They resisted very strongly body cameras. Our project was the first time where they, decided to try body cameras. It had never occurred to them previously to use surveys and focus groups and content analyses of the press, which we did in our project. And it's, debatable how much of an effect it has had. There's also something else worth mentioning. There's something called shitur ironi, which is kind of municipal patrols. And the idea here was that, the police as a national police force would cooperate more directly with municipal authorities, the sort of folks who did inspections and certifications and, handed out parking tickets and so on, particularly when it came to quality of life type crimes. And here again, I haven't followed it directly, but my impression as well is that, as with any large complex organization, there are forces within it and without it that seek to resist change. So they have not made a profound difference.
Great. So we have a question from Louisa Klebnikova, who is asking about Russian-speaking Jews, which you discuss in the book. We haven't talked about. What are their perceptions of the police? Is it a question of over-policing, under-policing? How does it differ? And I would also, if you could also mention, and I know we don't have much time, but since you talk about the ultra-Orthodox community in the book, and also just lately we've seen the issue of the question of the ultra-Orthodox community's compliance with the stay-at-home order, and the police having to try to monitor or deal with ultra-Orthodox Jews. And we've seen often when it comes to kind of the issue of military conscription. So if you could briefly just touch upon some of your conclusions, Guy, about those two groups, that'd be great.
An hour or so and I'm done. Russian immigrants, interestingly, show no difference from the control group, from Israelis that are none of these groups. The reason that we even thought of putting them on this study was that when the Russians came in the 1990s, there were two stigmas of the Russian men as being mobsters and of Russian women as being trafficked for prostitution. And many of them were stopped and harassed and mistreated for those allegations. And we thought, did any of this stick? And the answer is no. So the reason that the Russian immigration is relatively successful in its integration is shown very strongly in the results. So Russian Israelis of Russian descent, when they distrust police, it's for the same reason veteran Israelis do. They're inefficient, they don't do their job, but it's not anything to do with our ethnicity, our skin color, totally irrelevant. So that's why I haven't discussed here. So it's interesting, but you can sum it up in a sentence or two. The ultra-Orthodox is more complex because it's a changing community that is coming closer to society with resistance within it. So some are more leaning towards the state, of volunteering in organization, of shifting to more right-wing positions regarding the territories, and some are still kind of keeping away from the state. So in terms of policing, there was not a real problem with policing. So police violence is there, and it's criticized, but it's very specific. It's in demonstrations when police are claimed to use excessive force. So a regular, everyday basis, Haredi person walking down the street will have no reason to fear police. Now there are altercations around the issues of the stay home order or the issues of military draft, and then you have those clashes with police, but again, they're limited. In the focus groups, some interesting issues came about, regarding domestic violence. It's a very sensitive issue within the community. It has not been brought out in the open to be discussed, and they hinted that police could do better on those issues, but the poor performance was more about they simply don't know how to do it than they neglect us like the Arabs do. So if I would sum up, so Russians, it's like regular Israelis, and Haredim, it's an interesting, complex issue that ties up with the general developments of this community in Israel.
So we had one question which mentioned domestic violence, and wanted to bring up this question from Neil Diamond, who asked about gender, what percentage of your focus groups were women, and whether gender is a variable, whether the women and men have any difference in attitudes and trust towards the police.
In the survey, there was no significant results. We haven't put this in the focus of our attention. But you could say that racial profiling is something that men will be exposed to much more than women. Domestic violence, of course, is about protecting women. So all these issues are there, they're important. This would be in a different study or book, just too much for this book, but it is important, but it doesn't divide neatly. I think it raises different issues that need a more, I would say, focused study.
Thank you. Well, so just as the final question, and as the moderator, I'll take moderator's prerogative to pose a final question, one that's not really in your book, but maybe more speculative. Over the last 2 years, we've heard a lot about the political attacks against the police force, particularly the scrutiny the police commissioner has come under. The appointment of the police commissioner has become something of partisan debate in Israel. So might there be a kind of politicization of the police force? Would that then affect, do you think, partisan attitudes, left-wing Israelis and right-wing Israelis, let's say, having different perceptions of the police, even on the local level, because of the politicization that now surrounds high-level appointments in the police force?
I'll let Guy go first.
Stephen, go. No, go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, your question, Dov, brings a particular aspect of the institutions of governance and of the police in particular into the fore. And this really goes kind of the question of reform as well. The system, you know, in both the IDF and the police and in a number of other governmental institutions is we're going to appoint a person to be the chief. They are going to have a great deal of control for 3 years, maybe 4 years, you know, and then they're out. And so, you know, you can see that in the police. When Danino was the Mafkal, the commissioner of police, you know, he very much felt that, you know, a lot of these reforms that we've talked about were part and parcel of the professionalization of the police force, and needed to come about. The part of the problem they have with change is then after 3 years, 4 years, somebody else comes in who may have different perspectives, different priorities, and so on. So by its nature, it makes it a very powerful position. And, you know, how to put it delicately, when the senior leadership of the country may have issues with the police, that has a very, you know, strong coloration on the choices that are made. The police are very much aware of this, and have tried to avoid the politicization of their operations and their activities, with, you know, about the same success that the Israeli, Bagatz, the Supreme Court, has been able to, which is to say, sort of, kind of, but, you know, it's hard to avoid.
Thank you. Guy?
There's an irony here, because police was always perceived as a conservative, right-wing organization. In the past year or two, it became, at least in some descriptions, of a left-wing, anti-Netanyahu organization. And the last police chief, who was a settler, religious, more a typecast of a right-wing person, became the demon of Netanyahu and the government as being, for some reason, insistent on pursuing Netanyahu. So that's the irony in a larger sense. I am speculating, as you say, because it's outside the book. There is kind of a divide here between the security work police does on the street, which has an impact on certain groups, and the crime investigations, which is kind of another issue. So even if police is discredited on some levels by some people, would that lead to reform that engages with issues of minorities? I'm not sure. It could actually work the other way around. So there's an irony here. There's a twist of events. I'm not sure it will work for any significant reform in the way that we discuss in this book.
Okay, well, thank you, Guy, and thank you, Stephen. That was a really fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to ask all of the excellent questions that we received, but Stephen and Guy can look them over and respond if they like. After this, I want to thank everybody for joining us for this conversation. I also want to thank, before concluding, our co-sponsors for today's event. I should have thanked them at the beginning of my introduction. That's the Center for Near Eastern Studies at UCLA, the Center for Middle East Development at UCLA, and the Political Science Department at UCLA. They've all co-sponsored this event that's been brought to you by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I want to thank again Guy Ben-Porat and Stephen Popper for a wonderful discussion. Thank you both so much. And I want to encourage you all to join us for future webinars from the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. Thank you and be well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.